The core components of research and qualities of research is what this particular lecture will be about. And so when we're thinking about the research process, it's iterative. And as we talked about earlier, knowledge is built on consensus. So what often happens is on any particular topic with any particular question, it'll be asked again and again and will be tested with different types of methods. And new observations and experiences will occur, and then we'll rework and clarify the research problem. So it's iterative process in that it is sort of a cycle that occurs over and over again. And in that way, there's always another question that can be answered or another problem that can be addressed. And the sort of approach or direction in which we look at research is pretty important. So when we think about research, sometimes we start with our observations and work to theory, and that's often in qualitative methods. We'll want to explore a place or a space and just we'll immerse ourselves in that space and we'll observe it and come up with hypotheses and assumptions and generalizations within that space, and then we'll create a theory. We'll create a sense of what the patterns are and how the dynamics or relationships of the different variables exist. And other times, we'll start with a theory, develop a hypothesis out of that theory, and construct an experiment to test it. And that's what I showed you in the first introduction of what traditionally is the research process. But we're usually using both inductive and deductive processes when we're developing research, because we'll usually, if we have a question, we'll look at what have prior people talked about or tested already. And so that's sort of looking at the theory prior to developing your own experiment. And then grounded theory, as I mentioned in prior videos, is a type of inductive theory. So starting first with observations, reality, the experiential reality, and then developing theory from that. And so this is traditionally qualitative methods where someone will observe what's going on in a specific place and make generalizations about that. And logical reasoning is sort of the bridge between theory and research. So it allows us, this deductive and inductive logic allows us to bridge those two things together. And while deduction involves expectations or hypothesis from theory, induction involves generalizations from specific observations. So deductive is taking something that already exists and deducing from it, whereas induction is having some experiential reality and inducting, like finding a truth that can be stated from it. As I mentioned before, qualitative and quantitative are two different types of research. So qualitative could be participant observation studies where you're physically in a space and you're trying to understand what the general patterns and trends of that space are. And so you're looking at descriptions, you're not measuring and clearly defining a variable. You're letting sort of those variables come to you, those patterns come to you. Another aspect of research that's also qualitative is like interviews. So you are not controlling and assigning measurement, but instead you're open to having a conversation with someone and just sort of providing a space and listening and then analyzing, whereas quantitative usually has a lot more research design of operationalization and conceptualization at the outset of defining what the variables are, the particular time points and snapshots of observations you want and when you're going to get them, and clearly outlining that, whereas qualitative is usually more of an open process. So qualitative is non-numerical. It can provide greater richness of meaning. So if you have an interview with people like judges and you're asking them about bail reform and how it's influenced them, there's a whole bunch of topics that they could talk about that you may have not have ever thought to include in your study. And so there's a lot of richness of meaning that can occur. And the larger challenges is scoping that down and trying to really generalize about what is true. Whereas in quantitative focus, we're like very much shifting our frame to particular instances and snapshots, as I said before, and both are really helpful. There's often narratives that like quantitative is more rigorous, but really they are just different methods for different types of questions and different types of processes in answering a question. And I think a lot of that comes from too, like criminal justice is very centered on economics and psychology more recently. But in quantitative methods, and sometimes in qualitative methods, we're sort of more concerned with the aggregates, the culmination or the combination of a bunch of different observations to state what is truth. So we're not, sometimes we'll get into case studies where we like really explore a particular person or situation that happened and like really delve into one particular thing, but usually we're looking at averages and sort of taking a more bird's eye view of a situation. So whereas if you're a criminal justice practitioner, you're usually focused on your individual cases and your individual people, and you're not really observing the patterns as much. You can, obviously, if you've been in a particular space for long enough. But usually you're not looking at your clients as variables, as things to measure necessarily. But that's also the advantage of criminal justice, is that a lot of practitioners can also do research and sort of take a step back and observe the trends and the aggregates of the people that they interact with every day. And so because we're usually dealing with aggregates, there are anomalies and outliers. But as we said, research is probabilistic. So just because there's one instance in which your hypothesis is not true, that doesn't mean that it's not true. A pattern can still be a pattern if it's not reflected 100% of the time. So like in these images, like the blue butterfly is the anomaly, the blue pinpoint is the anomaly. Generally, all these things are red or orange, and we can state that in this setting, butterflies are red and orange, and that's true. So a lot of our truth, as we said, is consensus building, is collective, is about quantities and aggregates. And when we get into quantitative methods, we specify variables. And so we are trying to define what those variables are. And this is where we get into organizing and categorizing concepts and populations. And so we usually define attributes to those variables, like weight, or if you have detached or unattached earlobes, like those are characteristics that we attach to specific variables, which are a larger category. And so usually the independent variable that we're observing is what we're trying to see if it has an influence on the dependent variable. So the independent variable is always influencing the dependent variable or not. That's what we're testing. But the dependent variable is what is the getting the y, right? It's what the x is an independent variable and x is causing y. So the independent variable, as we talked about prior, needs to come before the dependent variable, and there needs to be some evidence that it's influencing the dependent variable. But it's really never that simple. There are a lot of independent variables that we might not be able to observe that are also influencing that dependent variable. Or there might be a moderator that's influencing whether or not that independent variable is influencing that dependent variable. So, for example, if we're talking about okay. And lastly, there can also be confounders, which we'll get more into, which is when the independent and dependent variable are influenced by some outside thing that we're not observing, that both of them are. So for example, the classic one is when ice cream trucks are out in the summer, crime is larger. What we don't see is the heat. The heat influences that more ice cream trucks are out and also might influence that there's more crime. And so that would be the confounder that's influencing both of those things, but we don't observe it unless we take on research methods that can help us parse out what is actually being influenced to cause the dependent variable.